JBS presents the Hampton Synagogue's Author Discussion Series with Rabbi Avraham Bronstein.
Okay, great. So you said that you would begin tonight with a reading.
That's
so
right.
Why don't you set it up? What part of the book are you going to be reading for us?
I have to read from the first part, the very opening, because the book is about secrets in a family, and anything I read past page 1 would disclose something that if you are going to read the book, I don't want to disclose. The only thing you need to know is that the book is centered around two sisters, one grieving for the other. They're both in their 30s. The elder one, who's 38, has died suddenly, tragically, and the younger one, Eve, who's the narrator, has come home from New York to Toronto, where they both were raised, to grieve for her sister. And her sister, Tam, was Canada's foremost television journalist. So that's all you need to know for the opening of the book. One loves, the other is loved. So Nana taught us. I look at the beautiful bones of her face and speculate about this pronouncement. My grandmother has always been beloved. And so my grandfather, long dead, assumes a peculiar poignancy. Once, in some rapturous, unimaginable youth before she married, Nana was the ardent lover. But no one is alive to tell us about the object of her affection, and she will not disclose his name. We are sitting in the living room of my mother's house, waiting for the funeral to begin. Outside, the sky is the eerie pewter I remember from my childhood, lightless even at midday. In this room 6 years ago, before our mother recovered the furniture yet again, Tam and I were laughing at the weather. Then, too, it was noon when I realized, after her baby's naming ceremony was over and the last guests had straggled out, that the day would not improve. That, to quote Tam, "This is it." I had fled to New York, whose winters are tamed by the city's determination to outwit the season. Tam not only stayed in Toronto, betraying our pact to leave the minute we could, but chose a profession that forced her to rise most mornings at 4 in order to be on the air. For her, the half year of darkness is permanent, I think to myself, and then think, permanent darkness. Paralyzed, I stare at Nana, imploring her to rescue me, but she is stoic, not emitting whatever feelings she no doubt has. The fact is, my sister, her eldest grandchild, is dead. The silence in this room is not the anticipatory hush preceding a family celebration, but the void of what cannot be accommodated. Tam. In speaking my sister's name, I have invaded Nana's solitude. I look at her carefully and observe, even in the somber room, that the skin beneath her eyes is gleaming. No one has seen my grandmother cry. Lawrence is coming, I state, more bluntly than intended. Nana's lips draw into a pucker of distaste. Once again, Eve has said the wrong thing. Why doesn't my admiration of my grandmother offset her reservations about me? Whenever I come home, I fancy myself an outlaw. Years ago, one of Tam's friends asked me at a party, "Does your mother feel like a failure because you had to leave Toronto?" "Had to leave Toronto," I ranted to Tam afterward. Does he really believe that all human beings want to live 4 blocks from their parents so they can eat together every Sunday night at the Bagel King? I chose to live in New York, as any person with, I know, Tam said tolerantly, a large soul. Inviting thighs, I was going to say. "Oh, Eve," said Tam predictably. Then I smile because she has been brought back to me. My grandmother turns away. She may not want to judge me, but she cannot help herself. I, who secretly view myself as her true disciple, find that at 35, I am back in my usual role in our diminished family. I concentrate on the dark green velvet that successfully masks the previous sofa, while my mind considers when my father will arrive from his house, whether or not my mother will be collected enough to come downstairs, if Tam's children in the new enlightenment will be brought to the cemetery, and the thought that closes my throat, what Tam looked like at her death. The worst of several burdens I am trying to ignore is that Tam and I fought continuously since she got sick, as if the disease had afflicted our relationship along with her body, and that 2 weeks before she died, we argued so vehemently we did not speak again. As children, we had a truce that the sister who leaves the house after a fight has to shout into the closing door, I love you, in case she were killed in a car crash before mending the rift. Now I have committed the ultimate offense, whose consequences I must bear alone.
Thank you. I'm curious about the title of the book. So I read the whole book, and evening doesn't really play that much of a role per se. I was wondering maybe it's a play on the character Eve. Maybe.
You are correct. There are 3 meanings. One is that it has Eve's name in it, which pleased me. I have to have the title before I start writing, so that was a whole effort in itself. The second is that the Jewish day starts in the evening, and the frame of the book is Shiva, so it really does go from evening through the day, throughout the days of Shiva. And the third is that the world looks at these 2 sisters and believes that Tam, the elder one, has everything. She's got this very glamorous job. She's got a very devoted husband, 2 adorable children, an old beautiful house, and she's famous. Whereas Eve is deliberately indeterminate. She hasn't quite gotten her PhD. She can't get it together. She teaches in community college. She rents her apartments. It drives Tam crazy that her sister's sort of floating. Her sister, Eve, the narrator, is not jealous of Tam, but the world thinks that she is. And over the course of the book, there is an evening between the 2 sisters. It evens out. So that was the 3rd meaning.
I didn't catch that. Eve as an
That's
even.
okay.
Yeah, that's really good. So let me ask you, the idea of the book, or the whole kind of progression of the book, I'm wondering what your original inspiration was. Did you have a character in mind, or a particular scene, or the story is so intricate, so maybe you had like the whole plot kind of worked out, and then you worked backwards from the end. What was the inspiration for this book?
All right, so I have to give you all background. This book was going to be my easy book. This first chapter just fell out of me. It came to me as a surprise. I'm a very analytic, very controlled writer. I began as a poet. Language really matters to me. And I was really taken aback by this chapter that clearly had a fight. When I wrote the chapter, I didn't know what the fight was between the 2 sisters, and a secret, which I did know, but I didn't know how I would thread the secret through the book until the reader discovered it. And the chapter was so easy, I thought, oh good, I'm not going to have to, as I used to say, pull small pieces of skin off my body. That's how I describe my writing. This is just going to be a breeze. This book took me 30 years to get to the place that I wanted it to be. So much for the easy path. I have many, many outlines. I can't say I followed them directly. I probably moved more by the rhythm and the cadence. I wanted to hold your interest as a reader. And I'm also, as you could tell, obsessed with language. So there were 2 aspects to the book. There was the story that turned out to have more secrets than I expected, not just that one, but several. And then there was the language. I brought an exhibit. This is 32 pages, single-spaced, double column, of every word that appears in this book that I checked countless times to make sure either that it didn't appear too close to another word, because it's not, another of the same word, that is, because it's not that big a book, or if it was a very distinctive word, that I used it only once. So randomly, I picked B to give you a tiny taste of that. Boldly, bones, bored, bossing, bothering, bottle, boundless, bouquet, brace, braided, you get it. That alone took a few years. And by the end, in essence, what I felt was, I'm a crazy perfectionist. It doesn't work in human relations. It's really bad to be a parent if you're a perfectionist and you're spraying their clothes with stain stick before they've taken them off. The one realm where I could be a perfectionist was this book. So the answer is, things surprised me throughout. It's not autobiographical, but all kinds of tendrils and tidbits from my unconscious surfaced. I am the eldest of 4 sisters, thankfully all alive, all very close in age. So the whole sister thing fascinates me. And I don't know how many of you have sisters, but it's a thing if you do. And people who don't have sisters, like my mother, who was one of 5, but the only girl, always wished she'd had one. So the complexity of sisters, and you can see it in their relationship. There's this devotion, there's this sometimes almost insulting, there's tensions. I had to let all of that play out.
Right. And I noticed also that there's 2 levels of it, because there's Tam and there's Eve, but also there's the grandparents, right? There's Nana and there's Nella.
I'm having a great evening.
Right.
That's right.
And they're also sisters, and they also have this very strange relationship. And it's
There's
almost
a parallel, and in many ways, Nana can't help, as you've already heard, casting Eve in the image of her sister and her sister's very sorrowful place in Nana's life. And so that also intrigues me. Families are my subject, as you can hear, and the ways in which we polarize each other, stereotype each other, want to change but can't, sometimes can. So yes, those 2 parallels were playing out, and the book shuttles between the past and the present. So in the present, Tam's not alive, but her voice is in Eve's head throughout the entire book.
Which was going to be my next question, right?
Perfect.
Right? So let's pin that down a little bit more.
Sure.
Right? One of the things that was so interesting to me is that Tam is dead before the book starts, but she's such a presence in the book, not just during flashbacks, but also even in the present, right? She's popping into like people's thoughts, and she's speaking through different characters, right? What's it like trying to draw that out? Or like, what was the experience of trying to write a dead character into the present?
So one of the reasons I think it took me so long was not only the language, but it wasn't the sisters. They fascinated me from the beginning, and for 30 years I was intrigued by these 2 sisters. It was my need to change and to grow, because I began in my 30s and I finished in my 60s, and like anybody, I had endured considerable sorrow and grief and loss by that time. And I understood much more profoundly something that I discovered in my life. And again, this wasn't so intentional. I wasn't injecting these insights into these characters. But this afterwards, when I look back, this is what I came to understand, that when somebody dies, let's say she leaves you at a certain place, but you keep changing. And therefore, your relationship with the person who's gone changes too. Sometimes for the better, as you can get more compassionate and more understanding. As you grow, you come to have a better, deeper feeling for how that person was. And sometimes even to draw boundaries that you couldn't draw in life. Mm-hmm. And I, at that point, by the end of the book, had already lost my father for a considerable number of years. And I was fascinated by the way he became more and more present. And the person he was when he died, which was remorseless because he had Alzheimer's, disappeared. And my father began to return much more in the prime of his life. My sisters and I started using his expressions, telling stories. I was still in negotiation with him. And I really feel that that's what happens, that the dead keep you company. First, the loss is so hard that you can't, because the gap between being absent and present is so huge. But over time, if you're lucky, and if you keep thinking, they return. And I think that's something that allowed Tam to be, I mean, obviously she just dies in this book, mm-hmm. but you can hear that Eve's going to carry her with her.
Right, and you're doing it in 2 ways also, because Tam keeps kind of explicitly inserting herself into the story, right? Not to give too much away, right? But there's also that thing in the back of Eve's head that keeps reverberating through the book. So let's talk about Shiva a little bit more, right? You knew from the beginning that that was going to be the frame of the book, or did it just kind of develop that way as you started writing?
I knew as soon as that chapter happened, which was not something I expected. It's not the book I expected to write, but I knew as soon as it happened and it's set in a Shiva house that that's how it was going to be. My first novel, which is completely different, also takes place over 6.5 days because it's called Preparing for Sabbath, and it does. The framework is not the days; it takes place over many years, but it has 6+ chapters. So I guess the 6-7 number, which is an important Jewish number, it's a very organic framework for telling a story where, in the present, not that much happens, and yet people are coming in and out, telling you facts you didn't know. People are revealing things about your family that you didn't know. People say things that are really untoward that you can laugh about later. You can also get very exasperated by people. There's so much drama in Shiva.
No, for sure. And I think one of the things that I noticed about the end of this book is that certain things are resolved, but not all things. And there's like new issues that came up even in the last few pages that you know they're going to be taking with them forward. Right? There's not so much of a Shiva is over, but the story is like really just starting to a certain degree. Right? I'm wondering if you think that's, I guess from your experience, is that kind of how Shiva works, where things that you kind of went into it trying to get resolved may or may not get resolved, but there's always going to be these new things that kind of pop up that you take with you from that experience into the future a little bit.
I think in some ways, when Shiva works, and I think it's a brilliant Jewish invention, you're rich with all the things you've heard and exhausted, so you're a little bit more ready to go into the world. I thought you were going to say something else, which is, my best friend thinks she wants to know what happens to these people. And she says, I'm telling you it's a trilogy. I don't know if it's a trilogy. I always say the same thing, which is, if it takes me as long to write the next one as it took me to write this one, only my creator will be reading this book if you do the math. But I hope that you'll ask questions afterwards, because the questions are, as your questions are, so illuminating even for me, who's already finished writing the book. And one of the questions I got that was really intriguing was, do you think these two people, and I won't reveal who they are, will be happy after the book is over? And I had never asked myself that question. My job was to shepherd them till the last page, but I'd never thought, and then what happens?
Which I think is an experience lots of people have when they sit Shiva, and then it's over, and then they get up and they walk around the block, and then they sit down again and they say, so now what do I do?
Well,
that's basically where you leave them off.
You leave them off with the rest of your and their lives. Exactly.
Absolutely. Different question, maybe in a slightly different kind of track. Right. So Eve's PhD, the one that she's taking with her and she's never managing to finish, is about, I guess not too much of a spoiler to say this, right? It's about,
it's not.
Right. It's about English women, maybe like English feminist women between World War I and World War II. The women who were very restrained and were very constrained by the society in which they lived, and how they struggled against the expectations that society had for them. And I'm really curious about that in two ways. So number one, Eve, right, has all this freedom, and she's writing this PhD, but yet she's not really progressing past where those women were, because she hasn't really accomplished the things that they fought so hard to be able to accomplish. On the flip side, right, her sister Tam has done all of that stuff, right? She's out there in the world. She runs a successful, she's a hostess for a TV show, so she's managing people. She has a position of influence and authority. She has the family, right? So she really has it all in that sense. But you're also hinting in the book in various places that maybe she's not happy even though she has it, or maybe even she's living under her own set of constraints, right? So the same way that those women that Eve is writing about aren't free because they're subject to what society thinks, where society thinks they should be. Tam, who's so successful until her untimely death, is also living under a certain set of constraints or restrictions. I'm just curious what you think about that.
I think that's a really profound question, is what I think. And I think you're a very good reader. I think Eve's inability to finish and decide certain things, which she doesn't mind at all. Eve says of herself that sitting in cafes in foreign cities is her favorite activity in life. And Tam, who is like the whoosh of a future train, is always wondering, you know, how can you just sit there? How can you not be doing? Tam is clearly, as you can tell when you read the passages from the past, ambitious from the second she's born. She's driven. And again, I think sisters polarize each other, so partly having a very accomplished older sister makes Eve a little contrarian, but partly it's temperament, which is not about history, but partly it's really about Eve's relationship with her grandmother, because Eve is born into second wave feminism, not born into, but comes of age in second wave feminism, and Nana, with her PhD in chemistry, is first wave. And the books that Eve is writing about, the writers she's writing about, the British women from between the wars, were Nana's favorite writers and are in her library. So I think there's a generational bond there. And the other issue is, I am Canadian by birth, and when I was growing up, we read almost exclusively British fiction, which is what, coincidentally, Eve is obsessed with. We read British history. We were under the Union Jack until 1967, and we sang God Save the Queen. So Canada couldn't be more different, and I don't know the new Canada except when I visit my family. But in those years, I was steeped in British history and British literature, and I was fascinated by these women, as my heroine is, because, as you said, they grew up in provincial, very constrained lives, whether they were wealthy or less wealthy. And they came to London, World War I happened, they all, and I'm sure many of you know this, plunged into all these jobs because men were being slaughtered. A lot of British women could never marry because like 750,000 British men were killed, something like that. And so their fiancés, their brothers, everybody they knew, and they were taking over real jobs and tending to the wounded and running things. And when the war ended, they were those women now. They had left home, they had found the company of each other, they had had huge responsibilities, and they'd endured unfathomable losses. So they went through a kind of transformation, and I think those of us who were born into the second wave of feminism, it isn't the same, but also I vividly remember, and I have said this often, that I had home ec, glad I can sew, but we talked for more than one session in home ec about what to do about the problem if you were smarter than your boyfriend. How to help him feel okay. And the answer was never, why are you with a boyfriend? You're smart. Break up with your boyfriend, you know. It was a different world. And I think Eve very much identifies with the transition of those women, and you're right, she's striving to get there in her own way. So I think they influence her.
Okay, good. Here, one final question from me, and then we'll pass around the microphone. More general question. When somebody reads your book, so somebody goes to the reception across the way and buys a copy of the book and takes it home and reads it over Shabbat, what are the big questions that you want them to be thinking about after reading the book? What questions or issues do you want the book to spark for them or to come away with?
Well, I don't think that's how I think about it.
Okay.
First of all, I want you not to be able to put it down. It's the dream. When I was in high school, Toronto schools, I went to a Jewish day school, but all the schools sponsored, there was a contest for students in high school. And the contest was they gave you a set of titles, you could pick which one you wanted, and then you entered your essay and you saw what happened. So the title that I chose was Ballpoint Pens in Autumn, and I wrote this very somber story about a woman who was lonely in her room and a man who was lonely in his room, each of them writing. And I read it out loud to my mother, And she got tears in her eyes. And I looked at her and I thought, I'm going to be a writer. This is it. If you can do this with words, that's what I want to do. So the dream is to be so compelled by these people that you can't stop reading. And if you cry, that's a great bonus for me, or even get tears in your eyes. And if they stay with you and they make you think about family and bonds and how unsimplistic it is to be part of generations of a family and how memory gets transmitted and changed and distorted. If it leaves you with a kind of, I say this elsewhere in the book about other things, a kind of perfume of the past and amplifies your sense of what life can be, I'll be completely satisfied.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Any questions, comments, reactions?
So I recently was in Shiva, and it's not the reason for the question, but so much of the Shiva process is telling stories as a mourner. And those of us who have participated in Shiva, whether as a mourner or as a consoler, hear the stories told so many different ways. I'm wondering whether you use that in the book and how much of the book's structure is built around that.
I wouldn't say the structure, but I think you've captured something extremely important, which is, what does a writer want? Stories, right? And what makes a book complex is when the same people have different stories being told about them by different people regarded in different ways, which is exactly what you're pointing to during Shiva, that if people are telling stories, you hear this kind of story and that kind of story about the same person. You're reminding me of something, which is, my husband is Toby Kahn, the artist, and both sets of his grandparents were refugees from Germany, one with a more tragic story than the other. The one with the less tragic story was because his grandmother in 1933 was skiing on a vacation. She was very wealthy, she was out of Germany, Hitler became chancellor, and she said, I'm never going back, that man's evil. And because she stuck to it, and she was a very strong woman whom I was lucky enough to know, she saved everybody in essence. It's a longer story than that and a better story than that, but that's the essence of it. At the Shiva for my father-in-law in Jerusalem, some of the participants of that salvation story, who were then children, were paying Shiva calls in their 70s and 80s. And we told the story, the emblematic story that we have told our children that they can each recite about how Oma saved the family. They corrected the story. They were there, we weren't. One of our facts was wrong, but it was irrelevant. And the ending of the story, which was spectacular in terms of how it all tied together, was wrong. And it just was wrong. It wasn't a version. They were there, we weren't there, and we got it wrong. And I'm pretty sure, first of all, that my children will tell our version anyway, because it's ingrained in their lives. But when these wonderful visitors were leaving the Shiva, I said to them, do you mind if we stick to the old version? It's just so much better. And Toby, who paints to NPR all the time, told me, that's my husband, that he had heard that every time you take a memory out of your drawer mentally and you tell the story, when you put it back, it's subtly altered. And I really have come to feel that's true. So for a writer of fiction, almost anything could be justified because it's not a memoir. But you can see why Shiva would be a natural for a very Jewish writer who wanted to try to talk about family through many different vantage points.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.